Hey guys, this is Matt for cgtuts.com, and in these next two videos we're going to be finishing up the UVing for our Canon A1 camera. Now at this point, as you can see, we've got the main body sections of our camera UV'd, and now we're going to start moving on to all of these extra details. Now you might be thinking that we have an awful lot to cover, and I suppose in a way we do. However, the techniques used to UV these sections are going to be much the same as the ones that we used in the last two videos. So we're not going to be really covering any new techniques here, apart from maybe taking a quick look at cylindrical UVing techniques for some of these more circular sections on the top. So with that said, let's get going. Now you have to excuse me if I sound a little bit croaky today. I've got a little bit of a sore throat coming or something like that, but we'll push on regardless. Now this is where we left off. We have the main sections of the body now UV'd. So we're going to move on to our middle details group. So I'm going to click the visibility icon to hide the body sections and lens mount group, and then bring back our middle details group. And I'm just going to roll that down so we can see what's inside it. Now inside here we have a Canon sign, the back object, the stop down lever, which is this guy down here, the exposure switches on the side of the lens, the grip, which is this big section that sits on the front, and obviously the hinge at the very side. Now the materials that create these objects, now remembering that we're UVing based on the materials we'll be applying to these objects when they're rendered, there are really only three materials involved in this section. We have black kind of metallic plastic, we have a silver chrome material, and we have the leather section, which is on the very front of this grip object. It's these kind of flat polygons at the front here. So what we're going to do is basically create three separate UV maps for both the middle details and the top details section. We're going to create a black plastic UV map, we're going to create a silver UV map, and a grip leather UV map. So with that in mind, we're going to start right at the back here on the Canon sign. So with the Canon sign mesh layer selected, I'm going to switch over to our UV layout and then just slightly rearrange our viewports so that we can see everything. Now I quickly want to cover another UV mode and kind of give you the reason why I'm not going to be using it a lot for this object. Now as you see here, the Canon sign is, for all intents and purposes, basically just a cube. It's nothing too complicated basically. And a very simple way to UV this cube would be with the mesh layer selected. You can come up to the UV projection tool. Now remember, we've been using the Unwrapped tool up till now. But if we click UV projection tool, come down here to our options and change the projection type to Atlas, and then click once in our UV map, you can see that it actually unwraps things quite nicely. Now I'm just going to hit space so we can go in and take a quick look. Now you can see what we end up with in here is we have this section here, which is the front of this cube. Then we have all of the sides completely separate from each other, and then we have this back ring as well. So it's basically projected itself on this entire back section. Now this is good in some circumstances. If we were doing the decals now, we might be using the Atlas mode a little bit, and we might use it a little later on. However, for things such as base maps, when you want scratches running from one surface all the way around the model, so to kind of create a nice natural look, having these things separated out is not necessarily a good way to go. Now obviously this is a very small part of the model, but if you were to for some reason have a render kind of zooming in nice and close on this little sign on the back of the camera, you'd see, if the UV maps were laid out like this, that the scratches would stop at this very edge and then start again on this top section, and the same would be true for all of the other sides as well. What we want are for the scratches to kind of continue around the sides, and it will look much more natural that way. So I'm not going to be using the Atlas mode for this, although we might use it a little bit later on. So first things first, where is this UV map currently located? Well, let's go and explore. So underneath our UV maps drop down, you can see that by clicking once in Atlas mode, we've created a new UV map called texture. And just to clear this up, we don't want this guy for now, so I'm going to right click that texture and click delete. It'll ask us if we're sure. I'm going to click yes, and that will get rid of all UVs for this object. Now remember I said we're going to UV based on the material we're applying, so we've got a black material, a silver material, and the leather material on the grip. Now these objects on the back here are all black, so I'm going to come in underneath our UV maps, drop down, click new map, and under vertex map name I'm going to type in body details black and hit OK. And you can see that we get a brand new UV map in there. So with this guy selected, I'm going to go ahead and start selecting some edges on this object to aid ourselves when we use the Unwrap tool, so just like in the previous videos. So I'm going to zoom in, and what we're going to do is basically select this very corner edge. I'm going to go down to the bottom and do the same thing. then around to the other side, and select that guy. There you go. And then on the top as well. Now remember when you're UVing sections like this to look all the way around the object, because you'll notice that we've got edges here going down to this back face that aren't currently selected. Now a quick way to fix that would be to hold down Shift on your keyboard and double click, and it will select these loops for us. So it's now selected the edges all the way around to this hole on the back of the object. And with those edges selected, we don't actually need to select any more for this object. I'm just going to come up to Unwrapped Tool and click once in our UV view. Now you can see that things don't look very good at all, and the reason for that is because Seal Holes is currently on. You'll notice in our viewport here, you can see essentially we have this big red section on the back of the model. Now with Seal Holes turned on, what it's doing is it's treating this as a solid object. It's trying to UV this as if this was actually filled in with polygons. That's not what we want. So I'm going to come down and turn off Seal Holes. You can see that the red section goes away in our 3D view, and over here on the left, the UV layout is looking a lot more like I would expect. And this is now actually pretty much done, so I'm going to hit space for that. I'm going to zoom out slightly. I'm going to grab these guys, and remembering we want to keep this one-to-one space clear for now, I'm just going to move this off to the left, by which I mean right. Anyway, moving on, so I'm going to zoom out, and we'll now move on to this back object. Now moving on to the back object, it's a little bit more complex than the Canon sign we just UV'd, and as a result we're probably not going to be able to unwrap it so that it remains entirely connected in UV space. So we're going to have to split it up into separate pieces. Now the question we have to ask ourselves is, where do we want those splits to appear on the model? So, just like I said before, what we're looking for are for these scratches on these base UV maps to flow nicely across the surface. Wherever we split this up into separate segments, those scratches are going to stop and then restart. So we're looking to select edges where that stop and start thing will be the least noticeable. So what I'm thinking is that I'm going to UV the entire front section of this object, the entire back section of this object, and then the top, bottom, sides, this frame in here, and also these little circular things on the front will be UV'd separately. So now we need to go ahead and start selecting some edges. Now just like before, in order to separate these sections up in UV space, we need to surround each section with a loop of edges. So I'm just going to go in edge selection mode and start double clicking some edge loops. So I'm going to basically add in a loop running all the way around the front section of the model. So just holding down Shift, I'm just adding edge loops to my selection by double clicking them. And we'll come up to the top here and do the same thing. So we now have an edge loop running all the way around the front of this model. However, we want to split off this frame and these two round things on the front as well. So I'm going to zoom in slightly and double click this edge loop running around here. I'm going to zoom in to this section. I want to basically select this edge right on the corner in here. So I'm just going to double click that loop and select the same loop on this guy. So zoom all the way in and double click that loop. We now have these round sections, this frame, and this front section of the model completely separated up. So we now need to do exactly the same thing for the top, the sides, and the bottom of this model. So as you can see, I've now completed a loop selection around all of the different parts of this object. Now I've also gone ahead and added in the edges on the very corners of this inside frame, and that's just going to help the Unwrap tool to split this up from one single loop object into 4 separate planar objects. So with all of these edges selected, I'm going to come up to the Unwrap tool and click once in our viewport. Now as you can see, we instantly get a very nice UV layout in here. Now things need a little bit of cleanup, a little bit of rotation, but other than that we've got all of the different sections that we wanted, and we've dictated that by surrounding them with a loop of edges in 3D space. So I'm happy with this result, so I'm going to hit space to drop the tool. Now I'm going to orient these pieces a little bit better in UV space, so I'm going to come up to Orient Pieces. I'm going to change the direction to horizontal and click OK. And this will rotate things nicely for us. Then with nothing selected again, I'm going to come up to Pack UVs, and I'm just going to pack these into this one-to-one space. We don't want to stretch them, as their aspect ratio is already correct. We don't want to orient them, as we've just done that. So with just Pack selected, I'm going to click OK, and you can see that things lay out a little bit better in one-to-one space. So with that done, I'm just going to select all of these guys and move them off to the right, just above our Canon sign. That is our back object completed. So we're now going to move on to the stop down lever object, and as you can see we basically have 3 unconnected sections in here. So we're going to start work on each of them in turn, beginning with this guy. So with these polygons selected, I'm going to hit Shift H to hide the other two objects, and zoom in and take a look at what we have. Now, as before, we want to try and keep as much of it connected in UV space as we can, but there are going to be a couple of sections we're going to have to split off, and I think we're going to be splitting off this kind of section of polygons in the middle here, and also the ones that run around the outside. So we want to add an edge loop running around those two sections. Now, whenever you do this, it's always good to have a quick look at the model and see if there are any quick ways of selecting edges, and on this part, there in fact is a very quick way of selecting these edges. What we can do is come in and select these polygons down the back here, like so, and that guy, and then do exactly the same in the middle here, so just holding down Shift, just going to grab these guys in here. Then I'm going to hit Shift and up arrow to expand my selection once, and you can see that we have all of the polygons that make up those two other sections. I'm then going to hold down Shift and come up and click plus bounds, and that will add our edge loops for us. And that, in fact, is all the edge loops we need for this object. So I'm just going to come up to the Unwrap tool and click once in UV space. And you can see that we get these three individual sections really nicely laid out for us. So I'm just going to grab these and just move them up slightly. Then I'm going to hit U to unhide the other two sections. Now I'm going to work on this section next, so I'm going to double click that guy, hit Shift H to hide the other guys, and then zoom in and take a look at what we've got. So for this object, we now need to go in and decide where we want those seams to appear in UV space. Now, I think there are a couple ways you could do this, but probably the quickest and easiest way would be to separate out this middle section from the rest of the model. So I'm just going to continue this poly selection all the way around. I'm going to hit Shift and up arrow to expand once, and then come up and holding down Shift, click on the plus bounds button to add the edges surrounding these polygons to our current selection. Now you can see when we do this we have a slight problem. We also have these edges selected in here, and the reason for that is that they were already selected before I used the plus bounds key. So it's a good idea to always kind of clear your edge selection before you start using the plus bounds method. So for instance, I would in edges mode just click off so nothing at all was selected. Then I would switch to polygon mode and select the polygons I wanted, come up, hold down Shift and click plus bounds to just get the edges you want. Of course, this feature could also be a little bit useful sometimes. For instance, if you wanted to then add the edges surrounding these polygons to your selection, you could go back to poly mode, select these guys and plus bounds to add that in as well. So it's just a little something to look out for there. So I'm just going to deselect these guys from my current selection and come up and use the Unwrap tool. And you can see that we get the three sections we want in UV space. So I'm just going to hit space to drop the tool. I'm going to hit U to unhide the other sections, and that's so that we can see the UVs that we've already created for this object. Then I'm just going to grab these guys and just move these up a little bit like that. I'll then select the final section and hit Shift H to hide everything else. So just like the other objects, we now need to come in and decide where we want those seams to appear in UV space. Now first of all I'm going to hit Tab to move out of subdivision surface mode, as that just makes things a little bit easier to see. Now this is perhaps a little bit more of a complex object than the other two, as we have a definite inside and outside, but the easiest thing to do would be to try and separate those sections from each other. And to do that we need to split off these joining polygons. So I'm going to zoom in on this section. I'm going to try double clicking these loops in here just to select them and add them to the current selection. I'm going to shift click the other side of these polygons to add those guys to the loop. Make sure we get these as well. So we now have these edges selected, which will split the outside from the inside as well as these adjoining polygons. So why don't we go up and try and unwrap quickly. I'll just click once, and you can see we do indeed get those three sections. So we have this frame UV'd pretty much exactly as we want, so I'm going to hit space, grab those polygons, and just move those down a little bit, like so. And then we can start work on these sections. So I'm going to double click this section on the right, which is the inside of the model, and I'm going to hit Shift H to just view these polygons. So what I want to do is basically unfold this section into the net of a cube shape that I've talked about previously. So I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to start selecting some edges right on the corners in here. So I'm just going to select those guys down there, the exact same edges on the top. And it's really just a case of, if you can't immediately see which edges you want to select, it's just a bit of trial and error essentially. You go in and see what gives you the nicest layout. Now these edges in here should hopefully give us a nice net of a cube style UV layout. So I'm going to come up and click the Unwrap tool again and then click once. And you can see that we do indeed get that shape. So the inside of this section is now completely UV'd. So I'm going to grab these guys and move these down as well. Now obviously we need to get our other sections back, but when I hit U to unhide, these sections are going to reappear as well. So we just need to go in and quickly hide those. Then with these two bits already UV'd, we're going to select them and hide them and then work on this outer section. So exactly like the inside, we want to basically form the net of a cube. So I'm going to come up to the top here and I'm going to select some of these edges. I'm just going to continue this selection just down the side there, like so, and then tap up just to get to that edge, and do the same over here. So just select these guys, and then tap up to go all the way to the edge. Then we want to select these edges on here as well, just to split up this section. So I'm just going to add those to the selection, and with all of those edges selected, we should be able to come up to Unwrap and click, and get a nice net shape, just like we did for the inside. So we now have all of this model completed, so I'm going to hit U to unhide everything. I'm going to double click this section and move it down roughly into position. Now at this point you can see that everything is looking a little bit kind of random and all over the place, so we need to go in and start kind of arranging it in one-to-one UV space. However, because we've UV'd these separately, there's no way to know that the UVs are the correct size for each of these objects. So at this point I think it would be a good idea to go and apply a checkered texture. Now just before I forget, I'm going to switch this back object back into subdivision surface mode just so it matches the other two sections. Now we need to apply a new material to this object, so with nothing selected, I'm going to hit M on my keyboard and type in Details Black Metal. With that done, we can go up to the shader tree and have a look at our new material. Now we need to go in and add in our new checkered image map to that, so I'm going to come up to Add Layer and click Image Map and select the checker 4x4 image we've been using up to this point. Now the fact that you can see the image map displayed in the 3D view means that it's already using the correct UV map, so we don't need to change that. However, I am going to change from shaded texture to advanced OpenGL, and the reason for that is that we now want to go in and change the tiling on our texture, and advanced OpenGL is the only view mode that will allow us to see that tiling. So with our image map selected, I'm going to go to Properties, and under Texture Locator, down the bottom here we have Horizontal and Vertical Wrap. I'm just going to change both of these to 30 to match the other two materials we have in the scene. And you can see that we change the tiling of the checkers on our object. So we're now going to go in and clean up our UV map slightly. So I'm going to go in and we're going to start on these sections down here, which is the outside of this object. So what I'm going to do is just grab all of those polygons, like so. Then just come up and I'm going to orient them horizontally and click OK. And then we're just going to move those roughly into position. So I'm just going to grab all these guys. And what I'm going to do is put those like that. And grab that and just chuck it in that little hole, like so. So we should see that the checkers on this outer object are now all straight, which they are. So we can now move on to another object. So we'll move on to this guy next. So I'm going to grab all of these polygons and do the same thing. I'm going to orient them horizontally. And then I'm going to move them down. And remember, we want to try and create kind of a cube layout, basically. Sorry, a square layout if we can. So I'm going to move these down into position like so. Maybe put that just up there. And move that to there. And you can see that now these guys are looking perhaps a tiny little bit smaller than these back checkers here. So I'm going to grab all of them and we'll just scale them down slightly, which will increase the checker size. So we're just going to scale that down to about there, and then just tweak their positions just a little bit, like so. And then we can do the same thing on this section up here. So I'm just going to pull this down slightly, orient pieces horizontally, just to get everything nicely lined up. And we can go in and start moving them roughly into position. Now we want to check the checkers quickly, and it looks like I'm just looking at this section and this section, and they look roughly the same size, so I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm going to, let's see, grab this guy and where can we put this? We put this down there and then move this one up over to the side. We end up with something that is roughly kind of square shaped there. So with that done, we may as well now go and apply our checker material to these two other objects we've already UV'd. So I'm going to go and take a look at them in 3D space. And in our items list, I'm going to select the Canon sign and the back object. I'm going to hit M on my keyboard, and making sure that details black metal is the material selected, I'm going to click OK. And you can see straight away the checkers get applied, but they're obviously quite different sizes here. So as you can see, the Canon sign, the checkers are a lot smaller, so I'm going to select that in UV space. First of all, I'm going to rotate it ever so slightly, just to make that a little bit more horizontal. And with that done, we can just activate the scale tool and scale that down. And in doing so, we match the checker sizes as best as we can. So I'm just going to play around with the scale until it's roughly correct, and that looks about right to me. So I'm going to hit space to drop the tool. Then what we want to do is basically match the checker size of these back two objects to this front object. So I'm going to select all three in our items list so we can see the checkers on all three objects at once. Now you can see that quite clearly the checkers on this front object are a little bit smaller. So what we can do is grab the UVs for the other two objects, make sure we get all of them, and scale them up slightly. And in doing so, we scale down the checkers for both of these back objects, but maintain the relationship between the two. And with that done, the checkers look a lot more similar, and we can move on. Now, before we move on to the exposure switches layer, I'm going to come in and quickly grab all of the UVs for our stop down lever and just move these up outside of 1:1 UV space. Now, with that done, we can select the exposure switches layer and start taking a look at how we're going to split this up. Now, it's a little bit more of a complex object, but don't worry about that too much. A good way of approaching it would be to separate out the sections that you're sure about first, and then deal with a little bit more complex sections a little later on. So taking a quick look at this, I'd say that it's probably a good idea to keep all of these front faces connected. I'd probably like to keep these set of faces connected as well, and then the top, the back, and the bottom I'm going to keep connected as well. So knowing that I'm sure about those three sections, I'm going to go in and surround them all with a loop of edges. So starting at the top here, I'm just going to go in, go to edge mode, and start selecting some loops. So just holding down shift, I'm just double clicking these edges to add them to my current selection. I'm just going to go all the way around these front faces, like so. So we've now surrounded these front faces with an edge, an entire edge loop, which will separate it out in UV space. So now I'm going to do the same for this front set. So I'm going to select this top edge. I'm going to come down a little bit and select this edge. See if we can double click it, which we can. Continue all the way around, like so. And this is just separating out this set of faces from this front set. So I'm going to do the same thing down in this one. So just double click these edge loops. And, oops, sorry, my keyboard's playing up slightly. Continue that edge selection all the way around. And in doing so, we've separated out this set of faces, this top set of faces, and the set of faces that are running all the way around the model. And with that done, why don't we go in and take a look and see what happens. So I'm going to come up to the Unwrap tool, zoom in slightly, and click once in UV space. So as you can see, we have the three sections we completely surrounded with edges laid out nicely in our UV space. But we also have these other four sections, which are the bits that we didn't pay much attention to. So we want to concentrate on those sections, so I'm going to hide the other parts of the model. So I'm going to hit space to drop the tool and double click the three sections that we're happy with. And then with those selected, I'm going to hit H to hide them. I'm going to zoom in and start taking a look at where we can select some edges on these sections to help the Unwrap tool along a bit. Now for these back two sections, I'm going to select the edge running all the way around that back corner. And this is going to separate out these back faces from this strip running along the side. I'm going to do exactly the same thing down the bottom there. Then we can start work on these cylindrical items. Now this is the first time we've come across any items like this, any cylindrical items that we need to unwrap. And the method that I'm going to use to unwrap these is the same method that we're going to use to unwrap all of the dials that sit on top of the camera. So it's kind of an important one to cover correctly. Now it's a very simple method. All we're looking to do is basically split this cylinder up into two sections. This front set of faces, this circle of faces, and the entire side section. And what we're going to do is split it up so that the side section can unwrap into a big, long, thin line of polygons. So this will become a little bit clearer in a second once I start selecting edges. So first of all, I want to double click the edge loop running around all of these front faces so that we separate out this circle of polygons. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing on the top here. I'm going to double click that edge so we separate out that circle as well. Now we've also obviously separated out these side faces, however currently they're all joined up together, so it's not going to be able to unwrap this into a long thin line. To enable it to do that, we need to select an edge running from this side of it all the way to the back of that strip of polygons. So it's very simple. I'm just going to select two edges in there and tap up on my keyboard to continue that selection all the way to the back. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing at the top here. So I'm going to select two edges, tap up on my keyboard to select all the way to the back. Now with that done, if we go in and unwrap, what we should see is that we get these long, thin strips of polygons, and that's exactly what we're looking for. Now obviously at the moment they're not perhaps as straight as they could be, so I'm going to start playing around with some of these options down here to see if we can get a better result. Now, as you remember from before, we're not looking for a perfect result here. A little bit of curve or distortion in these meshes really isn't going to give us too much of a problem, as this is just being used for a base scratch map. But if there's a couple of settings down here that we can quickly turn on that might make this perhaps a little bit straighter, then it's kind of worth checking out quickly. So I'm just going to choose X for the projection axis. You can see that these stay curved, so that's not what we want. We try Y and it's still curved, so back to Z. Then I'm going to change the pinning axis from U to V. And you can see that essentially all it's doing is kind of making the size difference a little bit different each time. It's still remaining curved, so these two sections here, which are the outsides of these cylinders, they're going to be slightly distorted in our UV map, but it's honestly not too much of a problem. So I'm going to be happy with this result, so I'm going to hit space to drop the tool. I'm going to select all of these UVs and just move them down slightly into this lower quadrant. Then I'm going to hit U to unhide the other sections. We can now start adding material to these and then laying them out in UV space. So the first thing we want to do is apply a material to this entire object. So I'm going to deselect my currently selected polygons, hit M on my keyboard, and making sure that Details Black Metal is selected, I'm going to click OK to apply that material. And you can see our checker gets applied. So now what we want to do is basically align these nicely in our viewport. So I'm going to zoom in and start laying these out a little bit. Now I'm going to select these top three sections. I'm just going to come up to Orient and orient them horizontally, which should just even them out for us slightly. Then I'm going to move these up and start laying them out a little bit. So I'm going to move this up over to there, and then pop this section down like so. And what we should see is that these three sections have a similar sized checker, whereas these other bits that we UV'd slightly separately, obviously they're a little bit smaller, so we're going to have to grab this entire section, and the first thing we want to do is scale it down to match that checker size. So you can see a little bit further maybe. So I think that looks pretty much accurate. So now what we want to do is basically align this into a roughly square shape at the top here. So I'm just going to grab this guy. And actually let's grab both of these together. And I'm going to rotate them 90 degrees. Undo that, messed up. Try that again. So I'm going to rotate those 90 degrees. And just pull those up and put them in there like so. And I'm going to grab this guy. Having a lot of trouble with my tablet and my keyboard today for some reason. I don't quite know why, but I shall persevere. So I'm going to grab all of these guys and just move them up into position, like so. And if it's not a kind of square, when you're done, just anything kind of geometric is good, because at the end we're going to basically want to arrange these all into a square shape. So anything that you can get that is going to neatly fit against the other objects' UVs is a good thing to look out for. So I'm just going to grab this guy, rotate it a little bit, and put it up here, and then do the same thing for this one. So rotate it like that, and then move that up there. So you can see we've got roughly a kind of rectangular shape here. And we have all of the checkers looking pretty much the same size, which is what we're after. So this object is now done. So we're now going to move on to the grip layer, but before we do, I'm just going to grab all of the UVs for the exposure switches, and just move those up here over to the left, just out of this one-to-one UV space. Now with that done, we can select our grip layer and take a look at what we've got. Now at first glance, it looks to be quite a complex object, but if we follow the rules that we've put in place for the other objects we've UV'd so far, it's really not too complicated. We just need to take a look and see which parts we want to separate out. Now at first glance, I'd say I probably want to separate out the top, this side and the bottom, as well as this entire middle section, which is actually going to be an entirely different material. And once we've separated those out, all that's really left is this outer frame. and then this indent and cylinder, which is very similar to the setup that we had over on the exposure switches layer. The only difference being that this cylinder has a slight kind of rectangular indent in it, but we'll deal with that when it comes up. So the first thing I want to do is go around and select edges surrounding this top, side, and bottom section. So I'm going to come in and start double clicking some edge loops. You can see that that one gets us quite a lot of the way around the model. So I'm going to come down to here and start double clicking again, and just make sure that we get a loop running all the way around this top, side, and bottom section. Now I've also got some edges selected here that are on the very edge of the model, but we don't need to worry about those. That's not going to do anything for our Unwrap tool. So if that happens, you don't need to go in and deselect them. Now I need to also add an edge just up here, like so. So I'm going to add in these guys. Just tap up to continue that, and come all the way down to the bottom. And do the same thing, and tap up to get to this corner. Then we need to separate out this side here from this indent, so I need to select the edges running around this section. So I'm just going to tap up and then select these three, like so. Now we could UV this section and then UV the other bits separately, but considering we know what we're doing for this bit now, we may as well go in and select the edges. So we know we need an edge loop running around this back corner, so I'm going to add those into our selection. So select two and just tap up, like so. We also know that on this cylinder we want to select the edge loop running around these front faces, so I'm going to select two in that loop and tap up to continue that selection. And we also need to add a loop going from the front to the very back of this side section of poly, so I'm going to select two in there and tap up to continue that selection all the way to the back. If you go one too far, you can just tap down again to go back an edge. So with that done, we can now start taking a look at this outer frame. So what we want is basically to add in an edge at the very kind of the section where this metal material transitions into this leather material, which I think is going to be this point here. So I'm going to select two edges in that loop and then just hold down up, and hopefully we should run an edge all the way around this section. And it looks like we do. So I'm just going to go into that corner again and just check that we're linking up, which we are. Now the final thing is this indent in this cylinder. Now it's really actually not that complicated whatsoever. We just need to separate this indent from these front faces. So I'm going to select two edges in that outer loop and just tap up to complete that selection and make sure they join up at this corner. And I'm going to select the very corner edges of this section in here, which will allow this entire indent to unfold into a net shape. And we should hopefully see that in a second in our UV map. So now if I selected everything correctly, then I come up and click Unwrap and click once, we should get quite a nice UV layout. Okay, so if we go in and take a look to see what we've got, you can see that clearly this section here is maybe not what we want, but we have a couple of sections which are actually looking pretty good. We've got this bit up here, which is this side section, and that looks pretty good. We've got this top bit up here. Now the bottom bit, which is over here, is a little bit kind of weird in the middle, so we might have to redo that. We've got the bottom of this indent, we've got the side of the cylinder, those two bits are looking good. We've got this bit, which is the back of this indent, so that bit's fine. And down here we've got the inside of the indent itself, kind of UV'd out into that net shape that I was talking about. Then we've got the front section of that cylinder, so this entire bit in here is actually doing pretty good. We also have this inner leather section, which is looking exactly as we want it. So really the only problems we have is this frame section and this side. So I'm going to undo a couple of times to get our edge selection back. Give me a second, hope I don't go one too far. There you go. I'm just going to come up, and with the Unwrap tool still selected, I'm going to click once again in the viewport, and this will just basically reactivate the tool. It's exactly the same settings, so nothing much should have changed. So I'm going to zoom in, and first of all I'm going to take a look at this bottom section. I'm not going to worry about this frame for the minute because that might be a little bit more complicated, so we just want to basically get rid of the kink in this bottom section. So to do that, I'm just going to start playing around with some of these settings. I'm going to change the projection axis to X to begin with. And come up and take a look, and you can see that it's still a little bit warped up here. Change it to Y, and then look for it, and you can see that these bits are looking a lot better now. It's not getting any warping on the top or the bottom. Now ignore our frame for the minute, but if we take a look at everything else, we can see that the rest of the objects are looking exactly as we want. So I'm going to hit space to drop the tool because I'm happy with all of those sections. Then I'm going to double click the frame object, zoom in a little bit and take a look at what we've got. So I'm going to double click that in polygon mode, and I think we'll just hide everything else for the moment. So I'm going to hit Shift H on my keyboard, which will keep the selected polygons viewable. The only reason the Unwrapped tool was having a little bit of a hard time with this object is purely that it's just a little bit more complex than the other sections of the model. So what we can do is go in and select some edges to help it out slightly. So I'm going to come up to the top corner, and we're just going to go in and select all of the very corner edges of this object. So I'm going to do the same thing down the bottom here. Come around to this other side and double click that edge loop. Now you can see when I double click that, we also got this edge loop running up the side, and we don't want that. So I'm going to hit undo and come in and manually select that edge. Now from this point onwards, whenever I want to select an edge loop, I'm going to have to manually select it, because if I was to double click this one, I would also complete that loop that we didn't want down there. So I'm going to undo that, come in and manually select this edge loop, just like that. Make sure we haven't got any we don't want in there. So with that done, I'm now going to try and unwrap again. So I'm going to click the Unwrap tool and click once in our viewport. Now you can see that this section and these two sections are looking okay, but this front section, this one here, is looking a little bit warped. So I'm going to hit space to drop the tool, and instead I'm going to come in and double click these two edges as well. And in double clicking that, I will have selected this edge that I don't want, so I'm going to undo that and follow my own advice of manually select this instead. So I'm going to do the same over here. So now we've just separated out this section from the rest of the model. So I'm going to try and unwrap again. And you can see we get a little bit of a better result. We're still getting a little bit of a weird curve going on here, but the rest of the model is looking a lot better. So I think for the most part I'm happy with this, so I'm going to hit space to drop the tool. I'm going to grab all of these sections and move them over to the left a little bit, and then hit U to unhide the rest of the grip. So all that's left to do is to go in and add the material to this object and then organize all of the sections into UV space. And by now this should hopefully be becoming quite a simple procedure for you guys. So all I'm going to do is, with this object selected, I'm going to add in the material. So we want to add the details black metal material, which will give us our checker on the object. Then we can go in and start laying these out slightly. So I'm first of all going to select all of these objects, and I'm going to orient them horizontally and click OK, and then we can start laying them out in UV space. So I'm just going to pull these up a little bit and just try and get that geometric shape that I keep mentioning. So let's pull these up, maybe rotate this like so, so it fits in there. And then it's really just a case of going in and trying to fit this all together. Now, I'm not going to do that on camera, but obviously once that is all in, we need to organize these sections. But before we do, we want to make sure that all of the checkers on these objects are the same size as they are on the rest of the object. At the moment, you can see they're a little bit small. So what we want to do is go in and scale these down in UV space. In doing so, we'll make those checkers a little bit larger, and it'll make them match the size of the checkers on the rest of these objects. So I'm now going to go ahead and lay these out in UV space. So as you can see, I've now laid out the UVs into this slightly rectangular shape. Now please don't try and match exactly what I've got here. The important thing is that you just lay them out as nicely as you can in UV space. Now what I want to do is size the checkers on both this grip object and also on the exposure switches as well, so they match the size on these other three objects. So what I'm going to do is bring up the grip, the exposure switches and the stop down lever all at the same time so that we can view all of the checker textures on all three objects. Then I'm going to come in and select the UVs for the exposure switches, which are these guys up here. So I'm just going to select all of those. And we can see that the checkers on this object are perhaps a little bigger than they are on this object over here. So I'm just going to move these slightly to the left and then scale them up a little bit, which will scale down that checker texture. And that looks about right to me. So I'm going to press space to drop the tool. And now we need to select the UVs for the grip. So I'm going to select all of those guys. I'm going to move those down a little bit. And at the moment the checkers are perhaps a little bit big. So I'm going to actually just stretch this across a little bit so we can see a little bit better. Like so. So you can see the checkers on this object are much bigger than they are on these two over here. So I'm just going to scale that up slightly, which will scale up the size of the checkers. Like so. And it doesn't need to be perfect, but it's just somewhere roughly in the ballpark. And that, I think, looks about right. Now before we move on to the hinge, we're just going to quickly grab all of these UVs and move them off into their own little bit of space. Then I'm going to come over and select the hinge layer, and we can take a look at what we've got. Now we essentially have these three different items. These the top and bottom item are essentially exactly the same. And this middle section is a tube. Now, whenever I'm faced with a tube, there is a very simple way you can get this to unwrap, and that is simply to come around to the back of it and double click a single edge. So what this is going to do is basically split the polygons down this point and allow this tube to unfold in UV space. So that's going to do all we need for this section. Now for this top part, you can see that for the most part it might unfold quite well automatically. However, just to help it along, I'm going to select this bottom loop. And that's just going to split off these bottom polygons. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing on the bottom. So just zoom in a little bit, grab that edge, and then we can go and try the Unwrap tool. So I'm just going to zoom in, select the Unwrap tool and click once. And you can see that we already get quite a nice unwrap. Now you can see that this tube at the bottom here is a little bit distorted. So I'm just going to have a tweak around with the settings over on the left. So I'm going to try Z. And you can see that instantly that looks a lot better. This section now is much straighter. So I'm going to call this done. I'm going to hit space to drop the tool. Now we want to apply the material to this object. So with the hinge layer selected, I'm going to hit M on my keyboard and select the details black metal material. I'm going to click OK, and that will apply our checker texture map. Now, as we UV'd the three sections of this object at the same time, the checkers will be the same size running across them, so we don't need to go in and resize any of these sections, we just need to lay them out nicely in UV space. So with nothing selected, I'm going to come up and click Orient Pieces. With the direction set to horizontal, I'm going to click OK. Then we can just start laying these out. So I'm just going to move that over there, bring that up there, and just try and neaten things up a little bit to get that kind of geometric, either kind of rectangular or square pattern that we're looking for. So, I mean, that's as close as we're going to get with this object, I think. So now what we need to do is make sure that the checkers on the hinge are the same size as they are on the other objects. So I'm going to shift click the grip layer, and taking a look, you can see that actually we're not that far off. So I'm going to call the hinge object completely done. With that done, I'm just going to grab all of the UVs for this hinge object and just move them up out of this 1-to-1 UV space. And with that done, all of the middle section objects are now completed. So I'm going to roll up that group and hide it, if I can select it correctly. Then we're going to move on to the top details group. So I'm going to bring that guy in, and I'm going to select all of the objects in that group, and there's quite a few in there. And what we're going to do is just take a couple of minutes having a look at these objects and discussing roughly how we're going to go about UVing them. So if we delve down into the top objects, you can see that we've got quite a lot of detail going on here. But if we go in and investigate, you can see that none of these shapes are actually any more complex than the ones that we've already UV'd. Over in this section, we've got an awful lot of cylinders and things like that, but we know how to deal with those now. We've got this winder shape, which it looks maybe a little bit more complex, but it's really not. If you think we're just going to separate out this top section and the bottom section from the sides, it actually becomes extremely simple. Other than that, maybe the only difficult part would be this section in here, this little switch. But again, it's nothing really too complex. So moving across, we've got this middle section. This bit here is basically just a big bunch of cubes, so nothing too complex in there. This viewfinder section is very much like the thing that sits on the middle of the camera at the back. We're going to use a very similar technique to UV it. We're going to separate out the top and the bottom from the sides, and then UV this front section separately. So nothing too difficult there. This thing is really not too complex. We're just going to select a couple of edge loops in there, and it should be pretty easy to unwrap. And then over here we just have another bunch of kind of cylinder shapes, really. So what we're going to do in the next video is go ahead and UV all of these top objects. Then we're going to UV the lens object, which again is just a lot of cylinders. And once those UV maps are in place, we're going to start looking at how we can add decals or graphics to our camera. And again, we're going to be using a separate UV map to do that.